In every war, the victors decide what history remembers and what it will forget. World War II, often framed as the good war, was no different. Beneath the celebrated tales of liberation and triumph lies another record, one buried in sealed archives, burned in locked furnaces, or redacted beyond recognition. What we are about to uncover are not battlefield victories or stirring speeches. These are the dark fragments, stitched together from declassified reports, intercepted communications, missing trial records, and whispers of intelligence agencies that erased as much as they revealed. They are episodes so disturbing, so politically dangerous, that they were deliberately excluded from the narrative of a righteous war. This is not mythology or speculation. It is the scar tissue of history itself. Some documents bear the stamp "for eyes only." Others carry the warning, "do not release." Yet fragments survive, surfacing in unexpected places. A misplaced telegram, a survivor's testimony ignored, a Soviet file accidentally left unsealed. Each story you will hear tonight existed in shadow, hidden not by accident, but by design. Together, they reveal a darker, unspoken truth about the war we thought we understood. Some events were buried forever, and perhaps buried for a reason. Chapter 1: The Classified Dresden Firestorm Records. In February of 1945, as the European war edged toward its brutal conclusion, a city with little military significance was reduced to ash. Dresden, once called the Florence on the Elbe for its cultural splendor and Baroque architecture, became a furnace. The official line, repeated for decades, spoke of unfortunate necessity, an Allied bombing raid aimed at crippling German transport and communication. Yet the declassified fragments, pulled from British Air Ministry files and intercepted OSS memoranda, tell a different, far more disturbing story. Buried under layers of censorship lies a record of intent, precision, and deliberate silence. The operation was codenamed Thunderclap. Within internal RAF correspondence dated January 1945, senior commanders discussed the idea of an overwhelming strike designed not only to disrupt troop movements, but to break morale across Germany's civilian population. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, head of Bomber Command, communicated through telegrams that outlined a sequence of raids. First high-explosive bombs to shatter buildings and open roofs, then waves of incendiaries to ignite the exposed interiors, and finally additional strikes to prevent firefighters and medical services from responding. These were not miscalculations. They were, as Harris admitted in one redacted cable, measured executions of a firestorm strategy. On the night of February 13, 1945, at precisely 22:14, the first wave of Lancaster bombers appeared over Dresden. Sirens wailed, but many residents dismissed them as false alarms. By 22:30, the first strikes had ruptured water mains and blocked major streets. At 01:30, the second wave arrived, carrying thousands of tons of incendiaries. Survivors would later testify, accounts preserved in documents stamped "Forbidden, Do Not Release," that within minutes the oxygen was consumed from cellars and shelters. People suffocated without flames ever touching them. Entire families perished, trapped in underground chambers that became sealed tombs. American bombers joined later that day, February 14th, dropping additional explosives onto a city already consumed. While official histories would claim the Americans targeted railway yards and troop formations, decrypted German radio traffic intercepted by Allied monitoring stations told another truth. Civilian quarters, hospitals, and even refugee corridors were struck. Some transcripts, preserved by Soviet intelligence and discovered decades later in NKVD archives, note the destruction of makeshift camps housing women, children, and elderly fleeing the Eastern Front. Stalin's regime never forgot these records, using them quietly as leverage during tense post-war negotiations. The firestorm that engulfed Dresden reached temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Asphalt streets melted. Tornado-like winds pulled people into flames. Eyewitnesses, some of whose testimonies were gathered by Red Cross officials but deliberately excluded from public release, described scenes of charred bodies fused to pavements, mothers clutching children in their final moments, and human silhouettes permanently burned into the stone of buildings. Photographic evidence existed, but most prints were either seized or quietly destroyed by Allied authorities. A select few remain, marked with file codes like RAF Pers 327 or OSS GER 12 class, their contents too harrowing for official wartime propaganda. What makes Dresden uniquely haunting is not merely the scale of its destruction, but the deliberate burial of its truth. In Washington, military censors issued directives to downplay civilian casualties, presenting Dresden as a legitimate target. In London, official communiqué emphasized the disruption of enemy logistics. Meanwhile, internal correspondence circulated among senior officers, acknowledged privately what they denied publicly, that Dresden was chosen precisely because it had been spared large-scale bombing until then. Its intact infrastructure, wooden construction, and overcrowded refugee population made it a perfect target for testing the maximum effect of incendiary warfare. The silence extended into post-war tribunals. At Nuremberg, where the Allies condemned Axis atrocities, Dresden was conspicuously absent. No charges were brought, no inquiries allowed. British and American prosecutors ensured that German attempts to raise the issue were dismissed as propaganda. The Soviets, though armed with damning evidence, chose silence in exchange for concessions elsewhere. The destruction of Dresden was thus sealed as a military operation, a classification that erased its civilian reality. But fragments of truth surfaced. A 1945 report by US Army intelligence, catalogued as US4 Intel File 469B, noted inconsistencies in the official accounts and included first-hand statements from American pilots disturbed by their own orders. One captain described seeing fire corridors stretching for miles, with survivors attempting to flee only to be consumed in the inferno. His testimony, marked as psychological distress, was suppressed. British medical teams who entered Dresden weeks later compiled casualty estimates far higher than officially admitted. Early figures reached as high as 135,000 dead, though later publications reduced the number drastically to preserve Allied legitimacy. The Cold War deepened the silence. Both superpowers recognized Dresden as a potential propaganda weapon, but also as a mutual vulnerability. The United States and Britain feared comparisons to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while the Soviet Union feared attention on its own mass atrocities. Thus, Dresden remained a forbidden subject, one acknowledged only in whispers, one used quietly in the shadows of diplomatic exchanges. Classified documents continued to circulate in intelligence circles, marked eyes only, referenced but never publicly confirmed. To walk the streets of Dresden today is to walk atop layers of ash and silence. The reconstructed Baroque facades hide the unmarked graves of thousands, buried beneath rubble never fully cleared. For decades, citizens whispered stories the official histories denied, of firestorms, of shelters turned into ovens, of children who never emerged from basements. Only in the late 20th century did fragments of suppressed records begin to surface, pried loose from archives by historians and investigative journalists. Even then, much remains sealed, redacted, or destroyed. The classified Dresden Firestorm records are not merely evidence of military strategy, they are evidence of a calculated decision to erase, to silence, and to rewrite. They reveal the thin line between victory and atrocity, between necessity and terror. They show us that even the so-called good war contained shadows too dark for daylight, shadows deliberately hidden not by the defeated, but by the victors themselves. In those archives, stamped and locked away, lies the reminder that truth is the first casualty of war, and memory the second. Chapter 2: The Forbidden Pact at Reichenhall. In the final spring of the European War, when Berlin was collapsing under Soviet artillery and the Reich teetered on annihilation, a different kind of battle unfolded in secret. It was not fought with tanks or infantry, but with coded telegrams, whispered negotiations, and a dangerous exchange of promises. In late April 1945, at a requisitioned hotel in the Bavarian spa town of Bad Reichenhall, representatives of the United States Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence agency, met face-to-face with emissaries of Heinrich Himmler's Waffen-SS. The official histories would later speak only vaguely of surrender talks in Switzerland under the name Operation Sunrise. But within the sealed archives, in redacted cables stamped "erased from record," lies evidence of a more disturbing transaction. One that blurred the line between justice and betrayal, one that has remained buried for decades. The scene was a paradox. Outside, German civilians starved and fled as Allied forces closed in. Inside the commandeered hotel, Heavy curtains blocked the daylight while maps, cipher machines, and whiskey bottles littered the tables. The Americans, led by OSS officers under the supervision of Alan Dulles, station chief in Bern and future CIA director, were desperate to secure an early German capitulation in Italy and southern Europe. But the SS envoys had other goals. They came not as defeated soldiers but as negotiators carrying information too valuable to ignore. Files on Soviet troop deployments, dossiers on partisan movements in the Balkans, and above all, names of scientists and engineers whose expertise the Americans coveted. The negotiations were given a codename within OSS channels, Crossword. Surviving telegrams, preserved in fragments within US Army intelligence records, reveal coded references to packages and transfers. Later analysis by Cold War historians would suggest these packages were not prisoners, as officially claimed, but individuals earmarked for extraction. Rocket engineers from Peenemünde, chemical warfare specialists from Hidden Reich laboratories, and interrogation experts trained in methods too brutal to be acknowledged publicly. In exchange, the Americans offered not just leniency, but in some cases safe passage and protection from war crimes prosecution. The Soviets, meanwhile, were not blind. Stalin's NKVD had infiltrated intelligence circles across Europe. A double agent embedded within Swiss diplomatic networks intercepted fragments of the talks. Decrypted reports to Moscow dated April 22, 1945, warned of treacherous discussions between Anglo-American intelligence and fascist representatives, undermining agreed-upon Allied unity. Stalin was furious. At the Yalta Conference only weeks earlier, Roosevelt and Churchill had assured him that unconditional surrender was the only acceptable outcome. Now, behind closed doors, that principle was collapsing in real time. For the American side, the stakes were immense. With Roosevelt dead and President Truman newly in office, OSS officers argued that securing German expertise and limiting Soviet expansion mattered more than ideological purity. In confidential memoranda addressed to Washington, Alan Dulles framed the talks as a necessary evil to secure strategic advantage. Yet within those same memoranda, heavily redacted, but partially visible through declassification errors, lurks the truth. Himmler's envoys offered the lives and loyalty of their scientists in exchange for sanctuary. It was not surrender. It was barter. The Germans understood their position well. Himmler himself, increasingly desperate as Hitler retreated into delusion in the Berlin bunker, authorized these emissaries to negotiate outside the Führer's knowledge. Internal SS dispatches, captured later by US forces and filed under SS Arch 45 Black, record Himmler's explicit instructions. Safeguard personnel of exceptional value and ensure they fall into American hands, not Soviet custody. Among those named were figures like Werner von Braun, whose later prominence in the US space program would be celebrated without mention of his presence at these secret negotiations. The deception was layered. Publicly, the Allies insisted on complete unity, condemning any rumor of separate peace. Privately, OSS cables to London and Washington spoke in euphemisms. One transmission, recovered decades later from an Army Signal Corps archive, refers to agreement with German representatives for immediate cessation in sector to facilitate orderly transfer of assets. Those assets were never trucks or rifles. They were mines, records, and technologies, currency for the looming Cold War. The Soviets responded with fury. Soviet intelligence reports show that Stalin considered walking away from joint operations, suspecting betrayal at every turn. He instructed Marshal Zhukov to accelerate the advance on Berlin, determined to take the German capital before any further American maneuvering could reshape the battlefield. In this way, the Forbidden Pact at Reichenhall directly influenced the pace and brutality of the war's final weeks. The Red Army crashed into Berlin with unparalleled ferocity, driven not only by vengeance but by fear of exclusion. When the war ended, the traces of Reichenhall were systematically buried. Official Allied communiqué referred only to Operation Sunrise in Switzerland, carefully omitting the details of Bavarian contacts. Records of the hotel meeting were classified under multiple layers, with many files destroyed outright. Surviving German participants were either absorbed into American programs or quietly disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe. For those who resurfaced in US aerospace projects or intelligence agencies, their origins were carefully rewritten. At Nuremberg, prosecutors avoided all mention of these negotiations. To acknowledge them would have undermined the moral high ground upon which the trials were built. Documents that might have implicated American or British intelligence in deals with the SS were marked inadmissible or simply never presented. The tribunal's narrative demanded clarity. The Nazis were criminals. The Allies were liberators. Reichenhall could never exist in that framework, yet whispers persisted. In the 1950s, when the CIA began recruiting former SS officers for operations against the Soviet Union, fragments of the old pact resurfaced. Some of the very men protected under Reichenhall's shadow were deployed in covert missions across Eastern Europe. Soviet propaganda occasionally hinted at these betrayals, though Western media dismissed such claims as lies. Only in the declassified releases of the 1990s did researchers find proof: cables, memoranda, and intelligence summaries with gaps too obvious to ignore, their blacked-out lines revealing as much as they concealed. The Forbidden Pact at Reichenhall is remembered now not because it was admitted, but because silence itself became suspicious. Too many gaps in the record, too many vanished files, too many names that reappeared in American laboratories instead of prison cells. It represents the moment when World War II's end blurred into the Cold War's beginning, when the moral clarity of unconditional surrender gave way to the ruthless logic of survival against a new adversary. It is a reminder that even in victory, bargains were struck, secrets were purchased, and history was rewritten to hide the cost. Bad Reichenhall remains a quiet spa town, its hot springs and mountain air attracting visitors unaware of what once transpired in its hotels. Yet beneath its calm facade lies a history of betrayal and secrecy, sealed away by governments that claimed transparency but thrived on omission. The Forbidden Pact was never officially acknowledged, and perhaps it never will be, but the fragments that survive whisper its truth. That the war did not end cleanly in 1945. It ended in smoke-filled rooms, in coded telegrams, and in the shadows where enemies became assets overnight. Chapter 3: The Disturbing Experiments of Unit 731. In the remote reaches of northeastern China, where the frigid winds sweep across Manchuria and winter can freeze flesh in seconds, the Japanese Imperial Army established one of the darkest facilities of the 20th century. Its official name was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. To the outside world, it was a medical research center. To those who survived, or more accurately, to the very few who escaped, it was a slaughterhouse disguised as science. Known by its code designation, Unit 731, this installation was the epicenter of biological and chemical warfare research carried out on living human beings. What emerged from its laboratories did not vanish with Japan's defeat in 1945. Instead, much of it was deliberately concealed, bargained away, and absorbed into the arsenals of the victorious powers. The unit was established in 1936 under the command of General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant yet ruthless microbiologist whose ambitions were fueled by the empire's desire for unconventional weapons. Ishii secured enormous funding, drawing support from high-ranking officers in the Kwantung Army and even from members of the imperial household. He promised not only to create tools of war capable of breaking enemy armies without prolonged combat, but also to demonstrate Japan's scientific supremacy. What he created instead was a network of death camps disguised as research stations. Harbin, a city in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, became the hub of these operations. On the outskirts near the village of Pingfang stood a sprawling compound of concrete buildings, laboratories, and prison barracks. Guards patrolled electrified fences. Inside, thousands of prisoners, Chinese civilians, Korean resistance fighters, captured Soviet soldiers, and even Allied prisoners of war were subjected to experiments so brutal that the details remained disturbing even in the clinical language of declassified files. Survivors were rare. The subjects were referred to as marotas, meaning logs, a term chosen deliberately to strip them of humanity. The experiments varied in method, but shared one characteristic: total disregard for human life. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhus. Some were vivisected without anesthesia, so that researchers could observe the effects of disease on internal organs in real time. Others were tied to stakes in open fields, while plague-infested fleas were released from ceramic bombs dropped from low-flying aircraft. In one particularly chilling test, groups of captives were forced into freezing outdoor conditions until their limbs solidified into ice. Doctors then poured hot water over the limbs to study the stages of frostbite, recording precisely when gangrene would set in. Evidence of these atrocities surfaced in fragments during the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, but much was never presented. What remained hidden for decades were the secret deals made by the United States to secure Ishii's research. Declassified US Army intelligence memoranda, marked Top Secret, Joint Use Only, reveal that as early as 1946, General Ishii was negotiating immunity in exchange for handing over his files. Washington, gripped by the emerging Cold War, saw biological warfare as a field too valuable to leave in Soviet hands. Instead of prosecuting Ishii and his subordinates, American intelligence officers spirited them out of Japan, relocating some to facilities like Fort Detrick in Maryland, where their knowledge was folded into America's own bioweapons programs. Soviet authorities were not unaware. In 1949, the Soviets staged the Khabarovsk war crimes trials, presenting captured Japanese officers who confessed in detail to Unit 731's activities. The proceedings were dismissed in the West as propaganda, yet the transcripts aligned disturbingly well with documents that later emerged from US archives. The Soviets themselves did not publicize the full extent of what they learned, for they too absorbed the knowledge into their expanding biological warfare research at Sverdlovsk. Both superpowers found it more useful to conceal than to condemn. The cost of this silence was borne by the victims and their descendants. Records suggest that as many as 12,000 men, women, and children died inside Unit 731's walls. If one includes the broader field tests, such as plague bombs dropped over Chinese villages, killing untold thousands, the death toll may reach into the hundreds of thousands. Yet for decades, survivors were denied recognition. When Chinese delegations attempted to raise the issue during early Cold War conferences, their claims were dismissed as exaggerations, their evidence ignored. The victims remained invisible, erased by the strategic priorities of greater powers. Inside the classified files, the brutality is recorded in chillingly clinical terms. An American intelligence summary from 1947, catalogued as US Army Intel BW Report 12 Forms, notes that subject exposed to Bacillus anthracis expired within 72 hours. Autopsy revealed pulmonary hemorrhage consistent with accelerated inhalation model. No names, no humanity, just data. Another report describes frostbite trials. Lower extremity exposed to 20 Celsius for 3 hours. Tissue rigidity confirmed. Rewarming resulted in immediate necrosis and septicemia. Each line is a life, reduced to statistics, erased from the record except as a contribution to weaponization. The concealment extended beyond the laboratories. When American occupation authorities in Japan began purging wartime leaders, Ishii and many of his associates vanished from public scrutiny. Official records listed them as untraceable, deceased, or minor figures unworthy of prosecution. In reality, many were living comfortably under US protection, working quietly in scientific institutions or military facilities. A few even entered Japan's post-war medical establishment, carrying their expertise into civilian hospitals. Their victims remained nameless, their suffering officially unacknowledged. Decades later, in the 1980s and 1990s, Japanese activists and historians began unearthing fragments of the truth. Lawsuits were filed in Tokyo courts by survivors and their families. Testimonies emerged of villages decimated by plague, of farmers who unearthed unexploded ceramic bombs decades after the war. Yet even then, the Japanese government resisted acknowledgement, citing lack of conclusive proof. Behind that lack lay the systematic destruction of evidence, records burned, witnesses silenced, and files locked in American archives. What little surfaced did so through accidental declassifications, or through Soviet files opened after the Cold War. The disturbing experiments of Unit 731 represent more than wartime atrocities. They symbolize the calculated erasure of truth in the name of geopolitical advantage. They remind us that the pursuit of scientific progress can be twisted into inhuman cruelty when divorced from morality. They reveal how victors, not just vanquished, manipulate memory, choosing which crimes to condemn and which to conceal. In the chilling silence that followed 1945, Unit 731's victims were buried twice, once by the hand of their captors, and again by the silence of those who inherited the knowledge bought with their lives. To this day, the name Unit 731 carries an aura of forbidden knowledge, a reminder of what science becomes when stripped of ethics and cloaked in secrecy. The archives remain incomplete, the files redacted, the full truth still denied. What we know is only the shadow of the whole. Yet even that shadow reveals enough. The screams behind laboratory walls, the frostbitten limbs shattered by crude tests, the black rain of plague-infested fleas released over unsuspecting villages. These are the fragments that survived erasure, fragments that whisper a truth too dangerous to be forgotten and too disturbing to be fully revealed. Chapter 4: The Hidden Massacre at Nemmersdorf. On October 21st, 1944, the war on the Eastern Front crossed a threshold from ferocity into nightmare. In the East Prussian village of Nemmersdorf, located near the Angerap River, the Red Army broke through German defensive positions and entered German soil for the first time. What happened in that small farming settlement became one of the most contested, suppressed, and ultimately buried atrocities of the Second World War. Official German reports, circulated by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry, painted scenes of unspeakable brutality. Civilians executed, women raped, children slaughtered. The Allies dismissed these accounts as Nazi fabrications. Yet decades later, fragments of Red Cross testimonies, Wehrmacht field dispatches, and even Soviet war diaries began to resurface. And they point to a grim truth. Something horrific did occur at Nemmersdorf, and it was deliberately erased. The Wehrmacht's Fourth Army had been retreating westward under relentless Soviet pressure. The village of Nemmersdorf, a quiet settlement of wooden houses and cobblestone paths, stood in the way of the Soviet 11th Guards Army. When Soviet tanks crossed the bridge at Angerap, the German defense crumbled. The few defenders were overrun, leaving behind a civilian population made up mostly of women, children, and elderly who had been unable to flee. Within hours, Nemmersdorf was transformed from a rural village into a killing ground. German troops, who retook the village 2 days later, found a scene that shocked even battle-hardened veterans. Field reports, preserved in Wehrmacht archives marked Geheim, classified, describe corpses strewn across farmyards, entire families shot in their homes, and women nailed to barn doors. One dispatch recorded, civilians of all ages executed without distinction. Female victims show signs of repeated assault before death. These reports were forwarded to Berlin, where Goebbels' ministry seized upon them as evidence of Bolshevik barbarism. Photographs were taken, bodies displayed, and foreign correspondents invited to witness the aftermath. Yet this propaganda effort tainted the evidence. After the war, the Nemmersdorf massacre was dismissed as Nazi manipulation, a psychological ploy to stiffen German resistance. The Allies, particularly the Soviets, had reason to bury the incident. For Stalin, whose Red Army bore the brunt of the war against Hitler, any suggestion of war crimes against German civilians threatened the fragile moral foundation of Soviet liberation. Soviet archives remained sealed, and official narratives insisted that the Red Army's advance was righteous, disciplined, and humane. The massacre at Nemmersdorf did not fit this image. It was denied, erased, and relegated to the realm of Nazi propaganda. Western historians, eager to distance themselves from Goebbels' fabrications, largely followed suit, consigning Nemmersdorf to the shadows. But the buried truth resurfaced in unexpected places. Red Cross officials who visited East Prussia in late 1944 left behind testimony stored in Geneva archives, marked unsuitable for public release. Their accounts align disturbingly with the Wehrmacht reports. Descriptions of civilians executed en masse, of women mutilated, of children left dead in farm carts. Post-war interrogations of Soviet deserters, stored in CIA files under designations like CIA Intel, GER, 1946, Report 17-1, corroborated these accounts. One Soviet soldier admitted under questioning that orders had been given to show no mercy as a warning to German civilians. Whether this was spontaneous brutality or calculated terror remains debated, but the evidence of atrocity is undeniable. The deliberate silencing of Nemmersdorf was not simply about propaganda. It was about preserving Allied unity. At the time of the Nuremberg trials, raising Soviet crimes against Germans would have fractured the carefully constructed narrative of justice. The Western Allies relied on Soviet cooperation, and so silence became policy. When German lawyers attempted to reference Nemmersdorf, judges ruled the evidence inadmissible, citing its origin in Nazi propaganda. The massacre disappeared from the record, erased not because it lacked truth, but because it was politically inconvenient. For decades, the massacre lived only in whispers among survivors. Refugees from East Prussia carried memories of the event across Germany, their testimonies often dismissed as exaggerations. Only in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, did Russian archives reluctantly open fragments of wartime diaries and reports. Within them were chilling notes written by officers of the 11th Guards Army, references to harsh measures against civilians, orders to liquidate resistance without distinction, and acknowledgements of excesses committed during the advance. Though never explicit, these fragments aligned too closely with earlier testimonies to dismiss. The silence began to crack. Today, historians tread carefully when discussing Nemmersdorf. The lack of complete documentation leaves space for deniability. Yet the convergence of independent accounts, Wehrmacht dispatches, Red Cross reports, survivor testimonies, and Soviet fragments forms a pattern too consistent to ignore. The massacre was real. Its details, though amplified by Nazi propaganda, were not entirely fabricated. The women nailed to barn doors, the children executed in their beds, the civilians slaughtered in farmyards. These horrors existed, then were buried beneath layers of political necessity. The hidden massacre at Nemmersdorf serves as a reminder of how truth can be manipulated, not only by the defeated, but also by the victors. It demonstrates how atrocity can vanish from official history, not because it lacked witnesses, but because its acknowledgement threatened alliances. It shows how propaganda can contaminate truth, making justice impossible even when evidence exists. Above all, it reveals the cost borne by those silenced, the villagers whose suffering became inconvenient, whose deaths were erased for the sake of unity, whose memory survived only in the shadows of classified files. Nemmersdorf today is a quiet place, rebuilt after decades of war and political transformation. Its streets bear no obvious mark of the events of 1944. Yet beneath the soil lie the remnants of a massacre the world was told to forget. And in the archives, still sealed, still redacted, lie the missing files that, if ever fully revealed, would strip away the last veil of denial. The massacre was hidden not because it was false, but because it was true and too dangerous to admit. History often ends with silence, not with answers. When the guns of 1945 fell quiet, the victors chose which stories would define the war, and which would be buried under layers of secrecy, denial, and deliberate omission. Dresden was reduced to ashes, its truth consumed in fire as much as its people. In Reichenhall, men in uniform exchanged oaths for immunity, reshaping the end of the war into the beginning of a new one. In Harbin, human lives were cut open in the name of science, their suffering erased by bargains struck in classified rooms. And in a small East Prussian village, families were slaughtered and forgotten, their voices dismissed as propaganda, their truth too dangerous to acknowledge. These were not accidents of memory. They were choices made by governments, generals, and intelligence services that understood the cost of exposure. Each buried event shows us not only the brutality of war, but also the fragility of truth itself. The records that remain are incomplete, the testimonies fractured, the archives redacted, and so we are left with shadows, haunting fragments of a history that refuses to stay hidden. What else lies sealed in the vaults, unspoken, erased? Perhaps the most disturbing truths of the war are not the battles we remember, but the secrets still waiting, buried forever, for a reason.